The knock on the door came too early, too hard, and Alara knew before she opened it that something was wrong. Her hands were still stained green from crushing mint leaves, her small shop thick with the smell of rosemary oil boiling on the back stove. She wiped her palms on her apron and pressed her ear to the wood. Apothecary. Open in the name of the King's Guard. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She had exactly 4 seconds to decide whether to run through the back door into the alley, or to trust that the layers of herbs soaked into her skin, her hair, her clothes, were enough to hide what she truly was. She chose to stay. Running would only draw suspicion. Standing still, calm, ordinary, was the only weapon she had ever needed in 26 years of hiding. She opened the door to find 2 guards in deep blue coats, the king's crest stitched over their hearts. Behind them stood a taller figure in a dark traveling cloak, hood low over his face, though nothing could hide the way he carried himself, like a man who had never once in his life worried about being told no. "We require herbs for the king's party," the shorter guard said. "Fever tonic, wound salve, something for travel sickness. We were told this shop keeps the finest stock in the region." Alara exhaled slowly, the fear in her chest unclenching just enough to let her speak. "Of course, please, come in." She stepped aside, and the hooded man entered last, ducking beneath the low doorway of her little shop. The moment he crossed the threshold, something shifted in the air, subtle, but unmistakable, like the pressure before a storm. Every instinct she had spent her whole life burying screamed at her to lower her eyes, to bow her head, to make herself smaller. She fought it down, and kept her spine straight instead. The hooded man lifted his head just slightly, enough for her to catch the edge of a sharp jaw, and eyes the color of a winter sky. He did not speak. He simply looked at her a moment longer than necessary, then turned to study the shelves, lined with jars and bundles of dried plants. "You have quite a collection," he said. His voice was low, controlled, the kind of voice used to being obeyed without ever having to raise itself. "My grandmother taught me everything," Alara answered, moving behind her counter, grateful to have something solid between them. She said, "Every plant has a purpose, if you know how to ask." "And what do you ask them for?" he said, still facing the shelves, though she had the strange feeling his attention had never actually left her. She hesitated only a heartbeat. "Whatever the person in front of me needs." He turned then, and for the first time, she saw his eyes fully, sharp and assessing, moving over her face, the way a man might study a locked door he suspected hid something valuable. She busied herself gathering jars from the shelves, willing her hands not to shake. "Fever tonic," she said, setting a small brown bottle on the counter. 2 drops in warm water, morning and night. Wound salve. Another jar, cool glass under her fingers. "For travel sickness. Chew this root slowly. It tastes bitter, but it works faster than anything you'll find in the capital." The shorter guard reached for the items, but the hooded man's hand moved first, closing gently around the root before the guard could take it. He lifted it, studied it, then looked back at her. "You seem very sure of yourself for someone so young." "I've been doing this since I could walk," she said. "Confidence comes from practice, not age." Something flickered across his face, not quite a smile, but close to one, gone before she could be certain it had been there at all. He set coins on the counter, more than the herbs were worth, and gathered the small parcel she had wrapped. "Thank you," he said simply, and turned to leave. The guards followed him out, and Alara stood behind her counter for a long moment after the door closed, listening to her own heartbeat slow back to something normal. She had done this 1,000 times, sold herbs to travelers, merchants, even minor lords passing through on their way to somewhere more important. She had learned to read a room the way her grandmother had taught her to read a plant, quickly, carefully, and without ever showing fear. But something about that man had unsettled her in a way she could not name. It was only after the shop door swung fully shut that she allowed herself to move to the window, watching through the thin curtain as the small group made their way back toward the center of town, where banners in royal blue had been strung between buildings for the better part of a week. The whole town had been buzzing with news of the king's arrival, a diplomatic visit meant to secure trade routes along the border, though nobody seemed to know exactly how long he intended to stay. She had told herself it did not matter. Kings came and went. Diplomats negotiated, signed papers, and left again for the capital, and life in her small town would return to its usual quiet rhythm. She had built her entire existence around not being noticed, and she intended to keep it that way for as long as she possibly could. She turned from the window and went back to her stove, where the rosemary oil had begun to simmer down to the thick paste she used every single morning without fail. It was not glamorous work, boiling leaves and roots into pastes and oils, but it was the only thing standing between her and a fate she had sworn, long ago, never to accept. Her grandmother had been the one to teach her the recipe, a careful blend of rosemary, clove, sage, and a rare mountain herb called duskroot that grew only in the shaded valleys 3 days north of town. Applied properly, in the correct order and the correct amounts, it could mask an omega's natural scent well enough to fool almost anyone, turning what should have been an unmistakable signal into something ordinary, forgettable, safe. Not perfect, her grandmother had warned her, years ago, hands trembling slightly as she measured the herbs into small clay pots. No mask is perfect, but it will be enough, if you are careful, and if you are lucky. Ilara had asked her, once, why it mattered so much. She had been young then, barely old enough to understand what her body was beginning to tell her, the way certain scents seemed sharper to some people than others, the way her mother used to flinch whenever certain men walked too close. Her grandmother had not answered with words. She had simply pulled a small wooden box down from a high shelf and opened it to reveal a single faded ribbon, pale blue, frayed at both ends. "This was your mother's," she said quietly, "before she was taken." That was the only story Ilara ever got, fragments passed down in careful whispers. Her mother had been an omega, beautiful and gentle, and utterly unable to hide what she was, back before the herbal blends had been perfected. A lord passing through, powerful and unmarried, had caught her scent one evening at the market, and within a week, she was gone, taken to his estate 3 provinces away, never to return, never even to send word. Ilara had been only 4 years old. She barely remembered her mother's face. But she remembered the ribbon, and the silence that followed whenever anyone mentioned her name, and the way her grandmother's hands had shaken every single time she measured out those herbs, as though she was fighting a war she had already lost once before. That silence had shaped every decision Ilara had made since. She refused to be the kind of omega who could be taken. She refused to let her body's own nature decide her future the way it had decided her mother's, and so she had spent years perfecting the blend her grandmother taught her, refining it, testing it, until she could walk through a crowded market at midday without a single person so much as glancing at her twice. It had worked for over a decade. It had worked through countless visits from traveling merchants, minor nobility, even a passing duke's envoy 2 years prior who had stayed in town for nearly a month. Nothing had ever slipped through. Nothing had ever come close. Until today. She could not explain why that particular moment in her shop had felt different, why the hooded man's gaze had lingered a fraction of a second too long, why something in his posture had shifted the moment he stepped through her door, as though his body had noticed something his mind had not yet caught up to understanding. She told herself it was nothing. Kings and their guards were trained to be alert, suspicious of everyone, careful of every stranger they encountered on the road. It meant nothing that he had looked at her twice. She finished straining the rosemary oil into small glass jars, labeling each one with careful handwriting, and set them along the shelf to cool. Outside, the afternoon sun had begun to slant lower, painting the dusty street in shades of amber and gold. She could hear the distant sound of the town square, voices rising and falling, the occasional ripple of laughter carried on the wind. A knock at the door startled her again, softer this time. She opened it to find Mira, her closest friend in town, cheeks flushed from hurrying. "You will not believe what everyone is saying," Mira said, slipping inside before Ilara could answer, already breathless with excitement. "The king himself was seen walking through the market this morning. Some people say he came here personally to inspect the border defenses. Others say he's searching for a bride among the noble houses nearby." Ilara's stomach twisted, though she kept her face carefully neutral. "I heard something about guards coming through earlier for supplies." Mira's eyes widened. "Guards? Here? In your shop?" "For herbs," Ilara said simply, returning to her counter, to busy her hands with something, anything, to avoid Mira's searching gaze. "Fever tonic and salve. Nothing unusual." "Nothing unusual," Mira repeated, disbelief coloring her voice. "Ilara, the king of the entire realm, walked through our little town today. And you're telling me it was nothing unusual? He needed medicine, same as anyone else, Alara said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew they sounded thinner than she intended. Kings get fevers too, I suppose. Mira laughed, shaking her head, clearly deciding to let the matter drop for now, though Alara could see the question still lingering behind her friend's eyes. They spent the next hour in familiar, comfortable conversation, Mira recounting every rumor circulating through the market, Alara half listening while her mind kept drifting back to that brief, unsettling exchange in her shop. By the time Mira left for the evening, the light outside had faded to deep blue, and Alara found herself standing at her window once more, watching the distant glow of torches near the town square where the king's temporary quarters had been set up in the old meeting hall. She told herself, again, that it did not matter. He would leave within a week, perhaps 2, and life would return to normal. But that night, as she prepared her nightly dose of herbs, carefully measuring duskroot and sage into the small stone bowl she had used every evening for over a decade, her hands trembled slightly, an unfamiliar sensation she could not entirely explain. She told herself it was simply exhaustion, the stress of a long day, nothing more. She did not yet understand that the man in the hooded cloak had already noticed something beneath the layers of rosemary and clove, something faint and strange that his instincts refused to let go of, no matter how hard he tried to convince himself it meant nothing at all. She did not yet understand that her carefully built world, the quiet, unnoticed life she had spent years constructing herb by herb, oil by oil, was about to be tested in ways she had never prepared for. She only knew, as she finally closed her eyes that night, that something in the air of her small town had shifted, quietly, irreversibly, the moment the king's guards had knocked on her door. Draven had not planned to return to the apothecary's shop the following day, yet somehow, his feet carried him there regardless, trailing 2 steps behind his personal guard, Colton, who had long ago learned not to question the king's occasional detours from official business. "We already have everything we need from the meeting with the Border Council," Colton said carefully, glancing sideways at his king as they walked through the narrow market street. "The trade agreements are settled. We could leave within the week." "I'm aware," Draven answered, his tone giving nothing away. "I simply require more of that travel route. It worked remarkably well." Colton said nothing further, though the slight rise of his eyebrows suggested he was not entirely convinced. Draven ignored it. He was not entirely convinced himself, if he was being honest, though he had no intention of admitting that to anyone, least of all his own guard. The truth, which he barely allowed himself to acknowledge, was that something about yesterday's visit to the small shop had lodged itself firmly in his mind, and refused to leave. It was not merely the woman's composure, though that alone had been unusual. Most people in his presence either bowed too low or trembled too visibly, unable to maintain the easy confidence she had shown while measuring out tonics and salves as though he were any other traveler passing through. It was something else, something harder to name. A faint impression beneath the heavy layers of rosemary and clove clinging to her skin, something his senses had caught for only half a second before it vanished entirely, smothered beneath the herbs before he could properly identify it. He had spent an entire restless night trying to place it, and had come up with nothing solid enough to explain the unease still sitting low in his chest. He was an alpha king, trained since childhood to trust his instincts above almost everything else. His senses had guided him through negotiations, through conflicts, through the delicate work of managing a kingdom still healing from years of unrest before his reign began. Those same instincts rarely, if ever, misled him, and those instincts were telling him, quite insistently, that something about the woman in that shop did not add up. The bell above the door rang softly as he stepped inside, and he found her already at the counter, sorting through a basket of dried leaves. She looked up, and for a brief moment, something flickered across her face, surprise perhaps, or wariness, before she smoothed it into polite professionalism. "Back again so soon," she said. "I hope the tonic worked well enough." "Remarkably well," he said. "I find myself in need of more of the travel route, and perhaps something for restlessness. The nights on the road have been difficult." It was not entirely a lie. He had, in fact, slept poorly. He simply omitted the reason why. She moved efficiently along her shelves, selecting jars and small cloth pouches with the same practiced ease he had noticed the day before. He watched her more carefully this time, studying the way she moved, the way her hands never trembled despite whatever nervousness might be hiding beneath her calm exterior. "You run this shop alone?" he asked, more out of genuine curiosity than any particular strategy. "I do," she said, not looking up from her work. "My grandmother taught me the trade before she passed. I've kept the shop going since." "That's quite a responsibility for someone so young." "I manage," she said simply, setting a small pouch of dried valerian root on the counter. "This should help with restlessness. Steep it in hot water before sleep." He picked up the pouch, turning it over in his hands, though his attention remained fixed on her rather than the herbs. "You seem entirely unbothered by my presence here," he observed. "Most people react rather differently when the king walks into their shop." Something shifted behind her eyes, quick and guarded, gone almost as soon as it appeared. "Should I be reacting differently?" "I'm simply making an observation," he said. "It's refreshing." She said nothing to that, busying herself instead with wrapping his purchases in thin paper, tying each parcel with practiced precision. He found himself, against his better judgment, reluctant to leave the shop just yet. "What's this one for?" he asked, gesturing toward a jar of pale green paste sitting near the edge of her counter. "Muscle soreness," she said. "Useful after long rides." "And this?" "Headache relief. Mostly feverfew and mint." He continued asking questions, partly out of genuine curiosity, partly because he was searching for any excuse to remain a while longer, watching her, trying to identify whatever it was that had unsettled him the day before. She answered each question patiently, though he noticed she kept a careful distance between them at all times, moving around the counter rather than beside it whenever he stepped closer to examine a jar. It was a small thing, easily explained by simple manners or professional caution, and yet, combined with everything else, it added another small piece to a puzzle he could not quite complete. "You're very thorough," he said eventually, setting the jar back down. "I imagine business must be steady, with skills like these." "Steady enough," she said. "People always need remedies for something." "And what do you use when you need a remedy yourself?" The question seemed to catch her slightly off guard. She paused, only for a heartbeat, before answering. "The same as anyone else. Whatever the ailment calls for." He nodded slowly, though something in her hesitation lingered in his mind long after he left the shop that afternoon, parcels tucked beneath his arm, Colton falling into step beside him once more. "You spent quite a while in there," Colton observed carefully. "The remedies here are unusually effective," Draven said, offering nothing further. Colton, wisely, did not push the matter, though Draven caught the faint knowing look his guard exchanged with one of the other soldiers as they walked back toward the meeting hall. He ignored it. Whatever curiosity was building inside him, he told himself it was simply professional interest, the natural caution of a king assessing anyone who seemed slightly out of place within his kingdom. He repeated this explanation to himself several more times over the following days, each time he found some small reason to walk past her shop. Each time he found himself lingering a little longer than the errand required. He told himself it meant nothing when he noticed the particular way she tied her hair back before opening each morning, or the quiet hum she sometimes carried while measuring out ingredients, unaware anyone was listening. He told himself it meant nothing, right up until the afternoon 3 days later, when the summer sky opened without warning, and a sudden heavy rain swept through the town square, catching dozens of merchants and travelers unprepared, sending them scrambling for cover beneath awnings and doorways. He had been walking back from a meeting with the border council when the rain began, and he ducked instinctively beneath the covered walkway outside the apothecary's shop, only to find her already there, having rushed outside moments before to gather baskets of drying herbs, left out on a low table, before the rain could ruin them. She was soaked through within seconds, her hair plastered against her face, her clothes clinging damp against her skin. She laughed, breathless, gathering the last basket just as thunder rolled somewhere in the distance, and for one unguarded moment, she seemed entirely unaware of his presence only a few steps away. And in that moment, with the rain washing away whatever careful layers of rosemary and clove she had applied that morning, something entirely different reached him, clear and unmistakable, cutting through everything else like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. He went utterly still. She must have felt the change in the air, because she turned toward him then, laughter still lingering on her face, only to freeze the instant she saw his expression. Neither of them said a single word. The rain continued to fall around them, But between the two of them, everything had gone completely silent, as though the entire world was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Her entire body had gone rigid, every instinct she possessed screaming at her to run, to explain, to do anything except stand frozen beneath the covered walkway, while the king of the realm stared at her, as though he had just uncovered a secret buried for decades. Because he had. She could see it in his eyes, the way his expression had shifted from mild curiosity into something far sharper, far more focused. He knew. There was no mistaking it, no pretending otherwise. Years of careful herbal masking had been undone by a single sudden rainstorm, and now the truth hung in the air between them, impossible to take back. "Say something," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're an Omega," he said quietly, not a question, simply a fact, laid bare between them. She said nothing, because there was nothing left to deny. Her basket of herbs sat forgotten at her feet, rainwater pooling around the fallen leaves. "An unclaimed Omega," he continued, studying her with an intensity that made her want to disappear entirely, hiding herself in plain sight. "For what? Years? How long have you been doing this?" "Please," she said, finally finding her voice, though it trembled more than she wanted it to. "Please, don't tell anyone." Something in his expression softened, just slightly, though his gaze remained sharp, assessing. Why would you need to hide something so completely natural? Most Omegas would consider themselves fortunate to be noticed by someone of my position. "I'm not most Omegas," she said, anger flaring briefly beneath her fear. "I never asked to be noticed. I never wanted this." He studied her for a long moment, rain still falling steadily around them, neither one moving to seek better shelter. "Come inside," he said finally. "We should not be having this conversation where anyone might overhear." She hesitated only a moment before nodding, gathering her ruined basket of herbs and leading him back into her shop, hands shaking as she closed the door behind them. The familiar scent of rosemary and dried herbs filled the small space, though she knew now it would do nothing to hide what he had already discovered. "How long?" he asked again, once they were alone. "My whole adult life," she admitted quietly. "My grandmother taught me the blend when I was young. It's always worked before." "Until today," he said. "Until today," she agreed, sinking onto a stool behind her counter, suddenly exhausted, in a way that had nothing to do with the rain soaking through her clothes. He remained standing, watching her carefully, though something in his posture had changed, less commanding now, more curious, almost hesitant. "Why hide at all? An Omega of your skill, and clearly your intelligence, would be welcomed by any number of respectable households." "Respectable households," she repeated bitterly. "Is that what you call it? Being taken from your home, your family, your entire life, simply because someone with more power than you decided they wanted you?" Something flickered across his face, understanding perhaps, though he said nothing yet. "My mother was an Omega," Elara continued, the words coming faster now, years of buried anger finally finding an outlet. "She couldn't hide what she was, not the way I've learned to. A lord passing through our town caught her scent one evening, and within a week, she was gone, taken to his estate, hundreds of miles away. I was 4 years old. I never saw her again." The shop fell silent except for the steady patter of rain against the windows. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, and to her surprise, it sounded genuine. "I made a promise to myself, a long time ago," she said, meeting his eyes directly, for the first time since he had discovered her secret. "I would never let that happen to me. I would never be taken from my life simply because my body decided to betray me." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she could not quite read. "And if I told you," he said slowly, "that I have no intention of taking you anywhere against your will?" She stared at him, wary disbelief written plainly across her face. "Forgive me if I find that difficult to trust, given everything I've just told you." "I understand your caution," he said, "but I am not the man who took your mother. And I have spent enough years ruling this kingdom to know precisely how much damage that old custom has caused. Families torn apart, lives destroyed, simply because tradition insists that alphas may claim whatever they discover." "Then why does that tradition still exist?" she asked, some of her fear giving way to genuine curiosity. "Because changing centuries of custom is not so simple as wishing it were different," he admitted. But that does not mean I intend to follow it blindly, especially not when it comes to someone who has clearly gone to extraordinary lengths to protect her own freedom. She studied him carefully, searching for any sign of deception, any hint that his words were simply a clever strategy to lower her guard. She found none, though that alone did little to ease the tension coiled tight in her chest. "What happens now?" she asked finally. "Now that you know." He considered the question seriously, longer than she expected. "For now, nothing happens," he said. "Your secret remains yours to keep, or to share, entirely by your own choice. I have no intention of forcing your hand." "And if others discover it?" she pressed. "Your guards, your court, anyone else who might not share your restraint? Then we will address that, if and when it becomes necessary," he said. "But I would ask one thing, in return for my silence." Her wariness sharpened instantly. "What?" "Simply the chance to know you better," he said. "Not as your king, and not as an alpha who happened to discover your secret. Simply as myself, and you as yourself, without pretense on either side." She studied him for a long moment, uncertain whether to trust the sincerity in his voice, though something in his expression seemed to carry genuine weight behind the request. "And if I refuse? Then I will leave, and your secret remains protected regardless," he said simply. "This is not a demand, Alara, it is a request." The use of her name, which she did not recall ever telling him, caught her slightly off guard, though she supposed it made sense that Colton, or one of the other guards, would have learned it during their earlier visits. She sat quietly for a long moment, weighing his words against years of carefully cultivated distrust, against the memory of her mother's frightened face in the few fragments she still remembered, against the ribbon still folded carefully in a small wooden box on her shelf upstairs. "I don't know if I can trust you," she admitted finally. "But I suppose refusing outright would accomplish very little, given everything you already know." Something that might have been relief crossed his features briefly. "Then perhaps we begin simply," he said. "Tell me about your grandmother, the one who taught you everything you know." The unexpected gentleness of the question caught her off guard, and for the first time since he had walked back into her shop that afternoon, she felt some of the tension in her shoulders begin to ease, just slightly. "She was stubborn," Alara said slowly, a small, unguarded smile tugging at the corner of her mouth despite everything. "Stubborn, and brilliant, and utterly convinced that every single plant in this world existed for a reason, if only you knew how to ask properly." He listened, genuinely listened, as she spoke, asking careful questions here and there, never pushing too hard, never demanding more than she was willing to give. The rain outside continued falling steadily against her windows, and somewhere in the quiet unfolding of that conversation, Alara found herself, against every instinct honed over years of careful hiding, beginning to wonder whether perhaps, just perhaps, this particular king might be different from everything she had always assumed a powerful alpha to be. She reminded herself, firmly, not to let her guard down completely. Trust, once given carelessly, was impossible to take back. But as the afternoon slipped into evening, and their conversation continued far longer than either of them likely intended, she allowed herself, just this once, the smallest possibility that her secret being discovered might not be the disaster she had always feared it would become. Outside, the rain finally began to ease, leaving the streets glistening beneath the fading evening light, and somewhere deep within the small apothecary shop, something quiet and uncertain had begun, something neither of them fully understood yet, but something that would change the course of both their lives, far more than either was prepared to admit. Alara woke the next morning to the sound of someone hammering a notice board just outside her shop window. She dressed quickly, still turning over the previous evening in her mind, unable to decide whether she had made a mistake by letting Draven stay so long, by answering his questions so honestly. She had spent years building walls around herself, and in the space of a single rainy afternoon, she had let a king walk straight through them. She told herself it changed nothing. He knew her secret now, yes, but he had promised to keep it, and she had no better option than to trust that promise, at least for the time being. She busied herself with her morning routine, grinding herbs, boiling water, measuring out her usual dose of rosemary, clove, and duskroot, though her hands paused halfway through the process, a strange reluctance settling over her that she could not quite explain. If he already knew, did the masking blend even matter anymore? She finished applying it anyway, out of habit more than necessity, and opened her shop as she did every morning, greeting the first customers with the same practiced warmth she always offered. Mira arrived shortly after midday, eyes bright with curiosity, clearly having heard some version of yesterday's storm and the king's extended visit. "You were seen talking with the king for nearly 2 hours," Mira said, settling onto a stool near the counter. "In the rain, no less. People are saying all sorts of things." "We were discussing herbal remedies," Elara said carefully, focusing on the jar in her hands rather than her friend's searching expression. "For 2 hours." He asked a great many questions. Mira raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced, though she let the matter drop for the moment, chattering instead about other town gossip, the upcoming harvest festival, a merchant's daughter recently betrothed to a wealthy trader from the eastern provinces. Elara listened with half her attention, the other half still replaying fragments of her conversation with Draven, the surprising gentleness in his questions, the unexpected sincerity in his voice when he had spoken of reforming old customs. She told herself not to trust it too quickly. Powerful men had said kind things before, only to prove themselves entirely different once they had what they wanted. She had heard enough stories, growing up, of alphas who charmed first and claimed later, leaving broken promises scattered behind them like discarded wrappings. And yet, when Draven returned to her shop 3 days later, this time without any guards trailing behind him, without any pretense of needing more herbs or tonics, she found herself unable to turn him away. "I have no official reason to be here," he admitted, standing just inside her doorway, looking oddly out of place without his usual escort. "I simply wanted to see you." "That's a dangerous thing for a king to admit," she said, though there was less wariness in her voice than there had been days before. "Perhaps," he agreed, "but I find myself tired of only ever speaking to people who want something from me, or fear me too greatly to speak honestly." "You've done neither, since the moment we met." "I was terrified of you," she said honestly. "I still am, somewhat. And yet you speak your mind regardless," he said, something like admiration coloring his tone. "That is rarer than you might think, among those who know my position." She allowed him to stay a while longer that afternoon, showing him how she prepared certain remedies, explaining the properties of various herbs, while he listened with what appeared to be genuine interest, asking questions that suggested actual curiosity rather than mere politeness. It became, over the following 2 weeks, something of a quiet routine, Draven finding excuses, sometimes flimsy ones, to visit her shop in the late afternoons, staying longer each time, the conversation growing easier, less guarded, with each visit. Colton, who accompanied him on official matters but was rarely present during these particular visits, grew increasingly curious about where his king disappeared to during the quiet hours before evening. He mentioned it once, carefully, during a private conversation. "The border negotiations were finished a week ago," Colton said, "yet we remain in this town." "There are still matters requiring my attention," Draven answered, though even he recognized how thin the excuse sounded. "Matters involving the apothecary shop, specifically," Colton said. Not quite a question. Draven did not answer directly, though his silence told Colton everything he needed to know. Colton, wisely, did not push the matter further, though he made a quiet note to keep a closer watch on the town's gossip, aware that whatever was developing between his king and the young shop owner would not remain hidden for long, no matter how carefully either of them tried to keep it private. Meanwhile, Elara found herself, almost against her will, looking forward to Draven's visits more than she wanted to admit, even to herself. He never pushed her for more information than she was willing to share, never pressed the matter of her Omega nature beyond the initial conversation, treating her instead simply as the skilled, intelligent apothecary she had always been, long before he ever discovered her secret. It was during one such visit, nearly 3 weeks after the rainstorm that had unraveled her careful disguise, that she finally allowed herself to ask the question that had been lingering in the back of her mind since their very first conversation. "Why haven't you told anyone?" she asked, watching him carefully as he examined a jar of dried lavender, turning it over in his hands. "Surely there would be some advantage to you, claiming an unclaimed Omega, even one as ordinary as myself." He set the jar down carefully, meeting her eyes with an expression more serious than she had seen from him before. Because claiming someone against their will has never brought anyone true happiness, only the illusion of possession. "I watched my own father force such arrangements throughout his reign, and I watched the misery it caused," not only to the Omegas taken, but eventually to the Alphas themselves, who spent their lives married to people who never once looked at them without fear. "That's not the answer I expected from an Alpha King," she admitted. "Perhaps that's precisely why I give it," he said. "I spent my childhood watching a broken system operate exactly as tradition demanded, and I promised myself, long before I ever met you, that I would rule differently, should I ever have the chance." She studied him for a long moment, searching, as she always did, for any hint of insincerity, any crack in his carefully composed words that might reveal a hidden motive beneath them. She found none, and for the first time since this entire situation began, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that perhaps he meant every word, exactly as he said it. "My mother," she said slowly, the words coming harder than she expected, though something about his honesty made her want to offer some in return, "was taken the same way you're describing, forced from her home, from her family, simply because a lord decided he wanted her." "I know," he said gently. "You told me already, during the storm." "I don't think I finished the story," she admitted. "There's more." He remained quiet, patient, giving her the space to continue when she was ready, rather than pressing her for details she was not yet prepared to share. "My grandmother spent years trying to find out what happened to her," Ilara continued. "She wrote letters, hired messengers, even traveled once, herself, to the estate where my mother had been taken. She was turned away at the gate, told my mother no longer wished to see her, though my grandmother never believed that for a single moment." "What do you believe happened?" Draven asked quietly. "I believe she was never given the choice to see anyone again," Ilara said, her voice tightening with old, familiar anger. "I believe she lived out whatever remained of her life, exactly as a prisoner, regardless of whatever title or comfort surrounded her captivity." Draven was silent for a long moment, something dark and troubled crossing his features. "I cannot undo what happened to your mother," he said finally. "But I promise you, Ilara, whatever happens between us, whatever choice you eventually make regarding your own future, it will remain entirely your choice. I will not become the man who did that to her." She wanted, desperately, to believe him completely, and slowly, visit by visit, conversation by conversation, she found the wall she had built around her heart beginning to crack, not from force, but from patience, from a kindness she had never expected to encounter in someone holding so much power over her fate. She did not yet know that outside the quiet walls of her small shop, word of the king's frequent, unexplained visits had already begun spreading far beyond the borders of their small town, reaching ears that would prove far less patient and far less kind than Draven himself had shown himself to be. Lord Garrick received the letter on a quiet evening in his estate library, 3 provinces away from the small border town where the king had apparently taken an unusual interest in delaying his return to the capital. He read the message twice, a slow smile spreading across his face as he considered the possibilities contained within its careful, coded phrasing. An unclaimed Omega, hidden for years behind clever herbal disguises, now known to the king himself, yet somehow still unclaimed. Such information, in the right hands, could prove remarkably valuable, whether used to secure political favor with the crown, or, should circumstances allow, claimed directly by someone bold enough to act before the king made his own intentions official. Garrick had long resented the king's reluctance to follow the old traditions his father had upheld so faithfully. An unclaimed Omega discovered but left unclaimed represented, to men like Garrick, a resource being wasted through unnecessary sentiment. If the king himself would not act, perhaps someone else might, and in doing so, secure considerable advantage for himself in the process. He called for his steward, a quiet, efficient man named Bellamy, and began making arrangements. Back in the small border town, entirely unaware of the letter now traveling swiftly through noble circles, Ilara continued her quiet routine, though the nature of her days had shifted considerably over the following weeks. Draven's visits had become a near-daily occurrence, sometimes brief, sometimes lasting well into the evening, the two of them talking about everything and nothing, herbs and politics, childhood memories and quiet fears neither had shared with anyone else. She found herself, gradually, allowing herself small moments of genuine happiness, laughing more freely than she had in years, looking forward to the sound of the shop bell announcing his arrival each afternoon. And yet, beneath that growing warmth, an old caution remained, refusing to fully release its grip on her heart. "You still hesitate," Draven observed one evening as they sat together in her small back garden, where she grew many of the rarer herbs unavailable from local markets. Even now, old habits are difficult to break, she admitted, especially when they've kept me safe for as long as I can remember. I understand, he said. I would not ask you to abandon caution simply because I've asked you to trust me. Trust is earned slowly, not demanded all at once. She appreciated, more than she could easily express, that he never pushed her beyond what she was ready to give. He never mentioned bonding, never spoke of formal claims or royal ceremonies, treating their growing closeness instead as something organic, something built entirely on mutual choice rather than obligation or biology. It was during one such quiet evening, weeks into their unusual courtship, that she finally worked up the courage to ask him something that had been weighing on her mind since their very first honest conversation. What happens, she asked carefully, if someone else discovers what I am? Someone less patient than yourself? Something flickered across his expression, brief but unmistakable concern. I've considered that possibility, he admitted. It's part of why I've kept our arrangement quiet, even from most of my own guard. The fewer people who know, the safer you remain. But eventually, people will notice something, she pressed. Your visits alone have already drawn attention. Mira suspects something, and if she suspects, others certainly will as well. I know, he said quietly. I've been considering how best to protect you, should word spread further than we'd like. Protect me how? She asked. By claiming me yourself, before someone else attempts to? The question hung heavy in the air between them, and for a moment, neither spoke, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down around them like the humid evening air. I will not claim you simply out of strategic necessity, Draven said finally, his voice firm despite the gentleness underlying it. If we ever reach that point, it will be because you choose it freely, not because circumstances forced our hand. Even if waiting puts me in greater danger? She asked. Even then, he said. I made you a promise, Alara. I intend to keep it, regardless of what pressures might arise around us. She studied him carefully in the fading evening light, searching, as always, for any hint of hesitation or hidden calculation behind his words. She found none, only steady, unwavering sincerity, and something in her chest loosened slightly, a knot she had carried for years, beginning, ever so slowly, to unwind. Tell me about your childhood, she said suddenly, changing the subject, though not entirely without purpose. She wanted to understand him further, beyond his position, beyond his careful restraint, into the person underneath all of it. He seemed surprised by the request, though he answered readily enough. My father was a difficult man to please, he said, strict, traditional, utterly convinced that strength alone determined worth. I spent much of my childhood trying to earn his approval, though I rarely succeeded. What changed? She asked. He grew ill, eventually, and I took over many of his responsibilities long before I officially became king, Draven said. I saw, firsthand, the consequences of decisions he had made throughout his reign, arrangements forced upon unwilling Omegas, alliances built on fear rather than genuine loyalty. I promised myself I would rule differently. And has it been difficult? She asked. Ruling differently than tradition expects? More difficult than I anticipated, he admitted. Many within the court still expect me to follow the old customs precisely as my father did. Change comes slowly, and not everyone welcomes it. She considered his words carefully, understanding, for the first time, the full weight of what he was attempting to change, not simply for her sake, but for countless others, who might otherwise suffer the same fate her mother once had. Thank you, she said quietly, for trying to be different. He reached out, slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished, and gently took her hand in his. She did not pull away. They sat together in comfortable silence as the evening deepened around them, neither one fully aware yet of the letter already traveling swiftly toward Lord Garrick's estate, nor of the careful, calculated plans already beginning to form in response to it, plans that would soon threaten the fragile trust they had built together, piece by careful piece, over the quiet weeks of their unusual courtship. Colton found Draven early one morning, before the shop windows of the town had even opened for the day, his expression grave enough that Draven set down the letter he had been reading, and gave his guard his full attention immediately. There's word from the capital, Colton said. Rumors have reached several noble houses regarding an unclaimed Omega discovered near the border. I don't know how the information traveled so quickly, but it has, and not everyone hearing it intends to remain patient. Draven's stomach tightened. Who specifically? Lord Garrick, among others, Colton said. He's already made inquiries about the town, disguised as simple curiosity, though my contacts within his household suggest he's preparing to send someone here directly. Draven cursed quietly under his breath, running a hand through his hair. He had known this possibility existed from the very beginning, had even warned Alara of it himself, and yet the reality of it arriving so soon still struck harder than he expected. How much time do we have? He asked. Days, perhaps, Colton said. A week at most, if we're fortunate. Draven made his decision quickly, gathering his cloak and heading immediately toward Alara's shop, Colton following close behind, casting worried glances toward the quiet streets around them, alert for anyone who might be watching more closely than usual. Alara opened her shop door to find Draven's expression far more urgent than she had ever seen it, and her stomach dropped immediately, some deep instinct warning her that whatever news he carried would not be good. What's happened? She asked, ushering him quickly inside and closing the door behind them. Word has reached the capital, he said, without preamble. Lord Garrick, among others, has learned of your existence. I don't know precisely how, though I suspect someone within my own guard may have spoken carelessly, or perhaps word simply traveled through the usual channels of gossip and rumor. Fear, cold and immediate, gripped her chest. What does that mean for me? It means we no longer have the luxury of time. I had hoped we might, Draven said. Garrick is not a patient man, nor a particularly honorable one. If he believes he can claim you before I officially do, he will attempt exactly that, regardless of the consequences. Can he do that? She asked. Simply take me, even knowing you've already discovered me first? Tradition grants considerable latitude to alphas, who act decisively, Draven admitted, hating the words even as he spoke them. Especially against an Omega without a formal claim already established. It's precisely the kind of loophole men like Garrick have exploited before. Alara sank onto her stool, the familiar fear from years of careful hiding, rushing back with overwhelming force. Then what do we do? Draven knelt beside her, taking her hands gently in his own. I will not let him take you, he said, fierce determination coloring his voice. But I need you to trust me, Alara, more than you ever have before. We may need to act more quickly than either of us intended. Act how? She asked, though some part of her already understood what he was suggesting. A formal claim, he said carefully. Not forced, not without your full and complete choice, but official enough to place you beyond Garrick's reach entirely. Once a bond is properly established and recognized, no other alpha may attempt to claim you, regardless of tradition or ambition. She stared at him, torn between the fear of losing her hard-won independence and the far greater fear of falling into the hands of someone like Garrick, someone who would show her none of the patience or respect Draven had offered from the very beginning. I need time to think, she said finally. I understand, he said. But Alara, I need you to understand something clearly. Whatever you decide, it must be your choice, not something forced upon you by circumstance or fear. If you choose differently, we will find another way to protect you, even if it means sending you somewhere Garrick cannot easily reach. You would help me disappear, even now? She asked, surprised by the offer. If that's truly what you want, yes, he said. I meant what I said from the very beginning. Your choice matters more to me than anything tradition demands. She studied him carefully, searching, as she always did, for any crack in his sincerity, though she found none, only steady, unwavering resolve. Slowly, some of the panic in her chest began to settle, replaced by a quieter, more focused determination. Give me until tomorrow, she said. I need to think clearly, without fear clouding my judgment. Take whatever time you need, he said. I will ensure you remain protected in the meantime, regardless of your decision. He left reluctantly that evening, posting Colton and 2 additional guards discreetly near her shop, careful not to draw undue attention, while still ensuring her safety through the night. Alara barely slept, her mind turning over every possible option, every consequence of whatever choice she eventually made. She thought of her mother, taken so suddenly, so completely against her will, never given the chance to choose her own fate. She thought of the ribbon, still folded carefully upstairs, the only remaining piece of a life stolen away decades before. She thought of Draven's patience, his steady kindness throughout their unusual courtship, the genuine respect he had shown her from the very moment their secret was first discovered. By morning, exhausted but resolved, she made her decision. She found Draven waiting near the town's edge, having spent much of the night coordinating quietly with Colton regarding Garrick's movements, growing increasingly concerned as new reports arrived suggesting Garrick's men were closer than initially expected, perhaps only a day or two away from reaching the border town. "I've made my decision," she said, approaching him directly, her voice steadier than she expected given how little sleep she had managed. "Tell me," he said. "I choose the bond," she said. "Not because Garrick forces my hand, and not because tradition demands it. I choose it because these past weeks have shown me something I never expected to find, not with an alpha, and certainly not with a king." Relief and something far warmer flickered across his expression. "Alara, I need you to be certain. This choice cannot easily be undone, and I would never want you to regret it later, believing you had no other option. I've considered every option," she said firmly, "and I choose this one, freely, because I want to, not because I'm afraid." He reached for her hands once more, holding them gently, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. "Then we proceed carefully," he said, "properly, and with full ceremony, so that no one, not Garrick, not anyone else within the court, can ever question the legitimacy of your choice." They had little time to waste, however, as reports soon confirmed that Garrick's men had indeed arrived far sooner than anyone anticipated, already making inquiries throughout the town, asking pointed questions about the local apothecary shop and its unusually skilled young owner. The quiet, careful courtship Draven and Alara had built together over the preceding weeks was about to be tested far more directly than either of them had prepared for, and the coming days would determine, once and for all, whether Alara's hard-won freedom could truly withstand the ambitions of men, determined to see tradition upheld, regardless of the cost to those caught beneath its weight. Bellamy arrived in the border town posing as a simple merchant, though his questions to the local tavern keeper carried none of the casual curiosity a genuine traveler might display. He asked specifically about the apothecary shop, about its owner, about any recent unusual visitors who might have taken particular interest in the young woman running it. The tavern keeper, unaware of the danger his answers might invite, spoke freely enough, mentioning the king's frequent visits, the rumors already circulating through town regarding a possible royal interest developing between the king and the shop's owner. Bellamy relayed this information immediately to Garrick, who had positioned himself only a day's ride away, waiting for confirmation before deciding how best to proceed. The news that the king had not yet formally claimed the Omega, despite weeks of obvious interest, only strengthened Garrick's resolve. If the king hesitated out of some misguided sentiment, Garrick intended to act while the opportunity still remained available. He gathered a small group of trusted men, careful to avoid drawing attention from the king's own guards, stationed throughout the region, and made plans to enter the town quietly, under cover of darkness, intending to locate the young woman and remove her before anyone could properly intervene. Alara, unaware of exactly how close the danger had grown, spent the day preparing alongside Draven and Colton, discussing the details of a formal bonding ceremony that would need to take place far sooner than either she or Draven had originally envisioned. The ceremony itself required certain traditional elements, witnesses of sufficient standing, formal declarations recognized by law throughout the kingdom, none of which could be arranged instantly. "We need at least 2 days to gather proper witnesses," Colton explained, reviewing the requirements carefully with both of them. "The local magistrate can preside, but we'll need additional nobility present to ensure the bond's legitimacy cannot later be challenged." 2 days, Draven repeated, clearly troubled by the delay. "That may prove more time than we have available. I'll increase security around the shop immediately," Colton said. "Additional guards, discreet patrols throughout the surrounding streets. If Garrick's men attempt anything before the ceremony can properly take place, we'll be prepared." Alara listened to their careful planning with a strange sense of detachment, as though she was watching someone else's life unfold, rather than her own. Everything she had spent years avoiding, formal claims, public ceremonies, the complete unraveling of her carefully hidden identity, was now happening rapidly, forced forward by circumstances entirely beyond her control. And yet, beneath the fear, something else had taken root as well, a quiet determination she had not expected to feel. She was not being taken against her will, as her mother had been. She was choosing this path herself, deliberately, with full understanding of everything it meant. That evening, as she prepared for what might be one of her final nights within the quiet, familiar walls of her shop, Mira arrived unexpectedly, her expression a complicated mixture of excitement and concern. "Everyone in town is talking," Mira said, settling nervously onto her usual stool. "They're saying the king intends to claim you formally, that some ceremony might happen within days. Is it true?" Elara considered denying it, out of old habit, before deciding her friend deserved honesty, especially given everything that had already changed. "It's true," she admitted. "Though it's more complicated than simple rumors suggest," she explained, as briefly as she could, everything that had happened since the day of the storm, her secret discovered, the unexpected patience Draven had shown throughout their unusual courtship, and finally, the growing threat posed by Lord Garrick and his ambitions. Mira listened with wide, astonished eyes, occasionally shaking her head in disbelief. "All this time," she said finally, "and you never said a word." "I couldn't," Elara said. "Not until now." "Are you frightened?" Mira asked quietly. "Terrified," Elara admitted. "But not of Draven, not anymore." Mira reached for her hand, squeezing gently. "Then I'm happy for you, truly. Despite everything happening so quickly. You deserve happiness, Elara, after everything you've survived." They spent the remainder of the evening together, Mira helping her sort through practical matters, which herbs needed proper storage before she might need to leave the shop temporarily, which local customers should be informed of any changes to her usual hours. It felt strange, almost surreal, preparing for a future so different from the quiet, hidden life she had maintained for over a decade. Outside, unseen by either of them, Garrick's men had already begun moving quietly through the darkened streets, carefully avoiding the increased patrols Colton had arranged, searching for any opportunity to reach the apothecary shop before morning arrived. It was nearly midnight when one of Colton's scouts spotted movement near the town's northern edge, several unfamiliar men moving with deliberate caution through the shadows, clearly attempting to avoid detection. The scout reported immediately to Colton, who wasted no time alerting Draven. "They're here," Colton said grimly. "Garrick's men, moving toward the shop as we speak." Draven's expression hardened immediately. "Gather every available guard. We move now." They reached the shop just as 3 of Garrick's men had begun quietly testing the shop's rear entrance, clearly intending to enter without alerting anyone inside. Draven's guards moved swiftly and efficiently, surrounding the intruders before they could react, disarming them without unnecessary violence, though the tension in the air remained sharp and immediate. Elara, startled awake by the sudden commotion outside, rushed downstairs just in time to see the confrontation unfolding through her shop window, Draven standing firm among his guards, addressing the captured intruders with cold, controlled authority. "You will return to Lord Garrick," Draven said, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet night air, "and inform him that his ambitions here have failed entirely. The woman he sought is already claimed, and any further attempt against her will be treated as a direct act of aggression against the crown itself." The men, clearly unwilling to test the king's resolve further, offered no resistance as they were escorted from the town under guard. Their failed mission, a clear message to Garrick that his plans had been discovered and thoroughly countered. Draven turned toward the shop, finding Elara standing in the doorway, her expression a mixture of relief and lingering fear. He crossed the distance between them quickly, pulling her gently into his arms. "You're safe," he said quietly. "I promise you, Elara, you're safe." She allowed herself, finally, to lean into his embrace, exhaustion and relief washing over her in equal measure. "This isn't over though, is it?" she asked. "Garrick won't simply give up so easily." "No," Draven admitted, "but we will be ready for whatever he attempts next. And soon, once our bond is properly established, his ambitions will have no legal foundation left to stand upon." They remained standing together in the quiet aftermath of the failed attempt, the danger temporarily averted, though both of them understood clearly that the coming days would require even greater caution than before, as Garrick, humiliated by his failure, would almost certainly attempt something far bolder in response. Garrick received news of his men's failure with cold, controlled fury, dismissing Bellamy from the room, before allowing his temper to show fully. He had underestimated the king's readiness, had assumed the isolated border town would offer easier access than it apparently had. The failure stung, not simply for its practical setback, but for the public embarrassment it represented, should word of it spread further among his fellow nobles. He would not accept defeat so easily. Within the privacy of his study, Garrick began reconsidering his approach entirely. A direct assault had failed, but there remained other avenues, subtler methods, that might still achieve his original goal, or failing that, at least ensure the king's reputation suffered considerably for daring to defy tradition so openly. He decided, after careful consideration, to attend the formal bonding ceremony himself, under the guise of paying respects to his king, while privately searching for any opportunity to disrupt proceedings or cast doubt upon the legitimacy of whatever arrangement Draven intended to establish. Meanwhile, in the border town, preparations for the ceremony continued rapidly, Colton and Draven working carefully to ensure every legal requirement had been properly satisfied, gathering witnesses of sufficient standing from among the local nobility and the town's respected elders. Ilara found herself swept into a whirlwind of preparation, entirely foreign to the quiet, solitary life she had maintained for so long. "You look overwhelmed," Draven observed one afternoon, finding her staring blankly at a collection of ceremonial garments Colton had procured from a nearby noble household, willing to lend appropriate attire for the occasion. "I've never worn anything like this," she admitted, gesturing toward the elaborate blue and silver fabric spread across her small kitchen table. "I've spent my entire life trying not to be noticed, and now I'm expected to stand before half the town and formally announce exactly what I've spent years hiding." "You don't have to do this," Draven reminded her gently, sitting beside her. "Even now, if you've changed your mind, we can find another way to protect you." "No," she said firmly, shaking her head. "I want this. I'm simply frightened by how quickly everything is changing." "That's understandable," he said, "but you won't face any of it alone. I'll be standing beside you throughout, and afterward, for as long as you'll have me." She managed a small smile at that, some of her nervous tension easing slightly. "Tell me honestly," she said, "what happens after the ceremony? What does life actually look like, as queen?" He considered the question seriously. "Considerable responsibility," he admitted. "Diplomatic duties, court politics, the ongoing work of reforming certain traditions, I believe cause more harm than good. It won't be an easy life, Ilara, though I hope, in time, it might become a rewarding one." "And Garrick?" she asked. "What happens to him, once our bond is established?" "His legal options become considerably limited," Draven said, "though I suspect he'll find other ways to make his displeasure known, at least for a while. Men like Garrick rarely accept defeat gracefully." She nodded slowly, absorbing this information with the same careful, analytical mind she had always applied to her herbal work, considering each variable, each potential outcome, before committing fully to her decision. The following days passed in a blur of preparation, fittings for her ceremonial attire, careful instruction regarding the formal declarations required during the bonding ritual, quiet moments stolen between Draven's official duties where they continued building the foundation of trust and understanding that had brought them to this point in the first place. Mira remained a constant source of support throughout, helping Ilara navigate the unfamiliar customs and expectations suddenly surrounding her, offering steady friendship amid the rapid transformation of everything Ilara had once considered her ordinary, quiet life. "Are you happy?" Mira asked one evening, helping Ilara adjust the delicate silver embroidery along the edge of her ceremonial sleeve. "Truly happy, beneath all this fear and uncertainty?" Ilara considered the question carefully before answering. "I think so," she said finally. "It's strange, feeling happiness and fear so completely intertwined. But when I think of losing what Draven and I have built together, that frightens me far more than anything Garrick might attempt." "Then that's your answer," Mira said simply. "Sometimes the things worth having are exactly the things that frighten us most." The morning of the ceremony arrived clear and bright, the entire town gathering within the central square, banners of royal blue mixing with the simpler decorations local merchants had added in celebration of the unexpected union about to take place within their small community. Ilara stood quietly in a private chamber, prepared for her within the town hall, watching through a narrow window as the crowd continued growing steadily below. Draven arrived to escort her personally, dressed in formal ceremonial attire, befitting his position, though his expression softened considerably the moment he saw her. "You look remarkable," he said quietly. "I feel terrified," she admitted honestly. "That's allowed," he said, offering his arm. "Terrified and ready are not mutually exclusive states." She managed a small laugh at that, some of her nervous tension easing as she took his offered arm, allowing him to lead her toward the ceremony that would formally, publicly, irreversibly change the entire course of her life. Among the gathered crowd, carefully positioned near the front alongside several other visiting nobles, Lord Garrick watched the proceedings unfold with carefully masked resentment, searching, even now, for any opportunity to disrupt what was quickly becoming an undeniable, legally binding union between the king and the Omega he had hoped to claim for himself. He would find his moment, he told himself, watching Alara and Draven approach the ceremonial platform together. Perhaps not today, but soon, he would find some way to make the king regret this defiant departure from tradition, regardless of how the ceremony itself concluded. The magistrate began the ceremony with the traditional opening words, his voice carrying clearly across the crowded square, though Alara barely heard the formal language, her attention fixed entirely on Draven standing beside her, his hand steady around hers despite the weight of every eye upon them. "We gather today," the magistrate continued, "to witness the formal bonding of King Draven of this realm, and Alara, daughter of this border town, in accordance with the laws and traditions recognized throughout our kingdom." A murmur rippled through the crowd at the mention of her name, many townspeople only now fully understanding the true significance of the ceremony unfolding before them. Alara kept her chin lifted despite the sudden attention, refusing to let old fears reduce her to the frightened hiding she had practiced for so many years. "Before we proceed," the magistrate said, following the required formalities, "does anyone present object to this union, or possess knowledge of any legal impediment preventing it from being properly recognized?" Silence followed, though Alara noticed Garrick shift slightly among the crowd, his expression tight and controlled, clearly biting back whatever objection he might have wished to raise, aware that no legitimate legal grounds existed for him to voice openly before so many witnesses. "Then we proceed," the magistrate said, turning toward Draven first. "King Draven, do you freely and willingly choose this bond, understanding fully the responsibilities and commitments it represents?" "I do," Draven said, his voice steady and clear, carrying easily across the square. "Freely, and without any hesitation." The magistrate turned next toward Alara, and for a brief moment, the entire square seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her response. She thought, briefly, of her mother, taken so many years ago, without any choice offered to her at all. She thought of her grandmother, carefully measuring herbs late into the night, determined to protect the granddaughter she loved from suffering the same fate. "Alara," the magistrate said gently, "do you freely and willingly choose this bond?" "I do," she said, her voice steadier than she expected, carrying clearly across the crowd. "Freely, and by my own choice alone." A collective murmur of approval rippled through the gathered townspeople, many of whom had known her for years without ever suspecting the truth she had hidden so carefully beneath layers of rosemary and clove. The magistrate proceeded with the remaining formal declarations, the exchange of traditional symbols representing the union, until finally, he announced the bond officially and legally established. The crowd erupted into celebration, cheers and applause echoing across the square, though Alara barely registered the noise, her attention entirely absorbed by Draven's expression as he turned to face her fully, something like wonder and relief mixing together behind his eyes. "We did it," he said quietly, "just for her." "We did," she agreed, allowing herself, finally, to smile fully and openly, without any trace of the careful restraint she had practiced for so many years. Amid the celebration, Garrick slipped quietly away from the crowd, his expression carefully neutral despite the bitter disappointment simmering beneath the surface. His plans had failed completely, the legal bond now firmly established beyond any challenge he might have hoped to raise. He would need to reconsider his position carefully, perhaps abandon his ambitions regarding Alara entirely, focusing instead on rebuilding whatever political standing this failed venture might have cost him among his fellow nobles. Colton, watching Garrick's quiet departure from a discreet distance, made a mental note to keep careful watch on the man's future movements, aware that defeated ambition rarely disappeared entirely, often simply transforming into quieter, more patient forms of resentment. The celebration continued well into the evening, the entire town joining together to mark the unusual, unexpected union that had unfolded within their quiet community. Mira found Ilara amid the festivities, pulling her into a tight embrace. "I'm so happy for you," Mira said, tears glistening in her eyes. "After everything you've survived, everything you've hidden for so long, you deserve every bit of happiness this brings you." "Thank you," Ilara said, genuinely touched by her friend's support throughout everything that had transpired. "I couldn't have managed any of this without your friendship." As the evening deepened, Draven found a quiet moment to pull Ilara aside from the celebration, leading her toward a quiet garden behind the town hall, away from the noise and attention of the crowd. "There's something I want to discuss with you," he said, once they were alone, "now that our bond is properly established." "What is it?" she asked. "I intend to formally announce reforms regarding the old customs surrounding Omega claims," he said. "No more forced bonds, no more traditions that allow powerful alphas to simply take whoever they discover, regardless of consent. I want every Omega throughout this kingdom to have the same choice you were finally given." Ilara felt something warm and profound settle deep within her chest, understanding fully, for the first time, the true weight and significance of what their union represented, not simply for themselves, but for countless others who might otherwise suffer the same fate her mother once had. "That would mean everything," she said quietly. "Not just to me, but to so many others who've never had the chance to choose their own future." "Then we'll make certain they finally do," Draven said, taking her hands gently in his own. "Together." She smiled, genuine and unguarded, the careful walls she had spent years constructing finally, completely dismantled, replaced instead by something far stronger, a partnership built on mutual respect, patience, and the freedom of choice she had once believed impossible for someone like herself to ever fully claim. 6 months later, Ilara stood before the grand hall of the royal court, a place she had once believed she would never set foot inside, let alone stand within, as a recognized voice of authority. The room, usually reserved for formal declarations and legal proceedings, had gathered an unusually large crowd, nobles and commoners alike, drawn by news of the reforms Draven had promised on the evening of their bonding ceremony. She no longer wore herbs and spices to hide her nature. She no longer needed to. The formal recognition of her bond with Draven had placed her legally beyond any question or challenge, and in the months since, she had discovered a new purpose, entirely separate from her old apothecary trade, working alongside Draven to reshape the very traditions that had once threatened to destroy her life before it truly began. "Today," Draven announced, his voice carrying clearly across the crowded hall, "we formally abolish the old custom, permitting alphas to claim unbonded omegas without their full and explicit consent. From this day forward, every union recognized within this kingdom must be freely chosen by both parties involved, without exception, and without regard to status or position." A ripple of reaction moved through the assembled crowd, some expressions showing clear approval, others displaying the same discomfort Garrick had once shown during their bonding ceremony months before. Change, particularly change that challenged deeply rooted tradition, rarely arrived without resistance, and Draven had spent considerable effort throughout the preceding months, building the necessary support among the court's more progressive nobles to ensure this reform could actually succeed. Ilara stepped forward then, standing beside Draven, addressing the crowd herself for the first time in such a formal setting. "I spent most of my life hiding," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of so many eyes upon her. "Hiding my true nature, hiding from a tradition that would have stolen my choice entirely, the same tradition that stole my own mother from her family many years ago. I stand here today not because I was taken, but because I chose this path myself, freely, and I believe every Omega throughout this kingdom deserves that same freedom of choice." The hall remained quiet for a long moment following her words, before scattered applause began, gradually building into a fuller, more enthusiastic response from much of the gathered crowd. Not everyone present agreed entirely with the reforms being announced, but few could argue against the simple, undeniable justice of her words. Among those present, standing near the back of the hall, Garrick watched the proceedings with carefully masked resignation. In the months since his failed attempt to claim Ilara for himself, His standing among the court's more traditional nobles had weakened considerably, his ambitions largely abandoned in favor of simply preserving whatever influence remained to him. He had learned, slowly and reluctantly, that the king's resolve regarding these reforms would not easily be shaken, regardless of any resistance offered against it. Following the formal announcement, Elara found herself approached by numerous nobles and commoners alike, many expressing gratitude for reforms that would protect their own daughters, sisters, and friends from fates similar to what her mother had once suffered. She listened to each story with genuine attention, understanding, perhaps better than anyone else within the entire court, exactly what these changes truly meant for those who had lived in fear of discovery for their entire lives. Later that evening, once the formal proceedings had concluded and the crowd had largely dispersed, Elara found a quiet moment alone, with Draven, within the private gardens attached to the royal residence. The same gardens where they had first discussed the possibility of formal reform months earlier. "You did it," she said, settling beside him on a stone bench overlooking the carefully tended flower beds. "Everything you promised, all those months ago." "We did it," he corrected gently. "None of this would have happened without you standing beside me, without your own story giving voice to reforms that might otherwise have remained simply theoretical to those who've never experienced what you survived." She leaned against him, comfortable and secure in a way she had never imagined possible, given everything her life had once demanded of her. "I still think of her sometimes," she admitted quietly. "My mother. I wonder if she would be proud, seeing what's changed because of everything that happened to her." "I believe she would be," Draven said gently. "Her story, and yours, together, changed something that desperately needed changing. That's no small legacy to leave behind." Elara considered his words carefully, feeling, for the first time in longer than she could remember, a genuine sense of peace settling over the old grief she had carried since childhood. Her mother's story had not been forgotten, nor had it been in vain. Instead, it had become the foundation for change that would protect countless others from suffering the same fate. "What happens now?" she asked, watching the last light of evening fade slowly across the garden. "Now," Draven said, taking her hand gently in his own, "we continue building whatever future we choose, together, one day at a time, exactly as we've done since the very beginning." She smiled, genuine and complete, understanding fully that whatever challenges still awaited them, whatever resistance remained among those unwilling to accept the changes now taking root throughout the kingdom, she no longer faced any of it alone, nor hidden behind careful layers of herbs and spices, designed to keep her safe from a world that had once seemed determined to steal her choices away entirely. She had found, instead, something far more valuable than any disguise could ever provide. A partnership built on genuine respect, patience, and the simple, powerful freedom of choosing her own path forward, exactly as she had always dreamed possible, long before she ever believed such freedom could truly belong to someone like herself. The garden settled into peaceful evening quiet around them, and for the first time in her entire life, Elara allowed herself to simply exist, unguarded and unafraid, beside the man who had found her not through force or tradition, but through patience, respect, and the quiet, steady building of genuine trust between two people who had chosen each other freely, exactly as it should always have been.